Welcome everybody. Here we are talking about Kropotkin and bread again. So the Conquest of Bread book club, and we're looking at chapter 13 this week, which was all about wages and the wage system, and basically attacking the ways in which he does this frequently throughout the book, which is he takes the attacks that people frequently throw at, his political points of view, and then lays them out and tries to deconstruct them and and lay out why they aren't going to work. And I really liked this chapter because, a lot of times we value compromise, and oftentimes in life, compromise is great. But as I've mentioned a few times throughout this, Kropotkin is very much not a compromise individual. He really sticks to his ideas and really seems like, you kind of have to walk the line, and it's very binary. It's 1 or 0. You kind of have to do it this way. And I think he makes a good case because as soon as you start to break down this wage system, which is in any way you go, well, what about this case? And okay, well, then engineers should make twice as much as someone who, mows lawns or whatever. As soon as you do that, you're basically opening the floodgates to capitalism again. You're just opening it up to, the same kind of wage system you have before, whether you call it, like one of the things he talks about is you could have notes that instead of dollars earned is more like hours worked. But even then, people are saying, well, shouldn't a doctor get more hours per unit worked than someone else who's maybe less, would be considered a less skilled trade? And he puts that line in the sand and says, no, we can't cross that, because as soon as you dip a toe over that line, the whole system's just going to erode away, and you're right back in this wage system that was the whole thing we're trying to escape in the first place. So I liked it quite a bit. What do you think, Peyton?
Yeah, I thought it was an interesting approach to criticizing certain kinds of collectivist or communist approaches to the wage system. Again, chapter 13 is specifically called the collectivist wage system. And he's also really linking into how the collectivist wage system isn't really properly taking down or conquering sort of what he might call bourgeois society or middle class values. And he says here at the very beginning of the chapter that they are committing, firstly, a twofold error. He says, quote, while speaking of abolishing capitalist rule, they intend nevertheless to retain two institutions which are the very basis of this rule, representative government and the wage system. So he's predominantly criticizing the wage system in this particular chapter, but going through it closely, you'll realize that he actually is also criticizing representative government through his criticism of the wage system. And so he does seem to think that, if we don't get rid of the wage system entirely, we're going to end up in a capitalist system once again. First of all, because it's impossible to entirely root out make distinctions between the values the values of goods which are produced by various kinds of workers, that everything is so integrated. We've been talking about how
right.
Kropotkin is making an analogy with the biological account of a kind of integration of functions. And so Kropotkin thinks that because of globalization, or at least because of some kind of aspects of trade and the like, there is no way in which you can perfectly distinguish who or which worker is making which product. And so there's, first of all, no way to actually make the distinction in any kind of even or fair way. And that, secondly, it's finally undesirable to make these distinctions in the first case, because you may be eroding some kind of perhaps virtue, he would suggest, that emerges or exists on the basis of sharing with one another. If you just try to make sure that everything is fair, or make sure that everyone is getting exactly how much they produced. And so he has some interesting arguments on both fronts.
Yeah, and it's interesting because he breaks down however you do this, whether it's hour notes, or what did he call them, wage labor checks. Yeah, so that it just endorses you for work. It's not actual money, but you're using that to buy the things that you need, and so that just effectively is the new money, right? I mean, it's it's all fiat currency in one form or another, right? It's not like any of this stuff is backed by gold anymore. It's intrinsically valuable because we all agree that it's valuable. And if hours worked is what produces it, then you can still have people that collect these things excessively, right? So he was talking about like landlords and so on, when you pay the rent with these checks, they're still going to collect more and more, and you're still going to end up with these people who have more and the people who have less, even though they're all working, regularly.
Yes, I think that that would be a fair implication from today's society. But I mean, specifically a criticism of the collectivist, I don't know that that's quite a fair criticism, at least in the case of fiat currency. So at the very beginning of part 4, he has an interesting line which I think responds to that here. He says, the collectivists say to each according to their deeds, or in other terms, according to his share of services rendered to society. They think that it would be expedient to put this principle upon into practice as soon as the social revolution will have made all instruments of production common property. But we think that if the social revolution had the misfortune of proclaiming such a principle, it would mean its necessary failure. It would mean leaving behind the social problem which past centuries have burdened us with unsolved. So again, Kropotkin is criticizing specifically the labor theory of value. So it's not necessarily the case that there's some kind of fiatness. There's a very serious sense in which, a number of these collectivists, in which Kropotkin is criticizing, have this idea in it that, as you produce, there's a certain value associated with the mere act of production itself. That production itself, as long as the good has some value, does have like an actual kind of ontological, or I'm not sure that it was, realist, but some kind of value. I mean, my point just being, I think that that's true in our current system, because he does have a number of interesting criticisms to that effect. Like, he's essentially saying that he has a quote in here somewhere about how it's on the basis of monopoly, and how we know that the wealth which a person is afforded on the basis of their wage is not a result of their labor inputted into the thing, but finally on the basis of some monopoly of that industry. And so he does have criticisms to what you are saying, but not specifically. I don't think that criticism falls specifically onto the collectivist. I could be wrong, though.
Well, I mean, like he says, as long as labor notes can be exchanged for jewels or carriages, the owner of the house will willingly accept them for rent. So I'm taking him to mean that as long as there is some type of currency that we're passing around, there's room for abuse there. There's room for some people to collect lots of it and other people to have less of it, no matter how you go about trying to set up this system of, whatever you want to call it, some kind of currency or labor notes or money, or, whatever you want to call it. As soon as you introduce that, then you're going to introduce the bickering over who should have more and is this fair, and, all this kind of fairness arguing that we know that greed and money can kind of bring into things.
Yeah, I mean, that part of it I think is absolutely right. I was just objecting to the concept of fiat being applied. I think that that's maybe a bit anachronistic. But anyway, so the second paragraph of part 3 speaks quite well to what you're saying here, specifically to the emergence of factions. He says, quote, well, to establish this distinction, referring to this distinction between qualified and simple work in the allocation of how you're going to value a person's labor, whether or not you're going to value a doctor or an engineer's work as more valuable than a miner. He says, quote, well, to establish this distinction would be to maintain all the inequities of a present system. It would mean fixing and dividing line from the beginning between the workers and those who pretend to govern them. And so the very creation of these kinds of distinctions between simple and complex labor is just going to reemerge and recreate these distinctions, right, which exist in the present system of capital. And Kropotkin thinks that this would end up just sort of collapsing in on itself. And this is where he moves into, a few paragraphs later, he moves into his criticism of Marx's labor theory of, well, actually Ricardo as well, but sort of lumping in Ricardo and Marx there on their theory of value. He says here, quote, he could not have concluded otherwise, referring to the fact that Marx maintained a distinction between complex and simple labor, having taken up his own account of Ricardo's theory of value and upheld that goods are exchanged in proportion to the quantity of work socially necessary for their production. And so there's this sense in which the actual exchange value of a particular product is different than the true value of a product, which is according to these thinkers, on the basis of how much work is expended in order to create that product. And there actually are some interesting arguments to this effect. It's not just some mystical, like this is the real value. It's a certain sense in which that would be like, if society were to sort of normalize, that would be the going rate of a particular product, because everybody is essentially awake for more or less the same amount of time. And so there are interesting arguments to that effect. But Kropotkin seems to think here that this is ultimately futile, because at the end of the day, workers, I'm trying to find like an interesting quote to explicate it quite clearly, but essentially he seems to think that at the end of the day, workers are, they're basically, there's no way to make a clean distinction between the different industries and the different aspects of a work. So, for example, in part, oh goodness, this must be the end of part 4, talking about trains. He says here, quote, "Is the inventor of the locomotive or the workman of Newcastle who suggested replacing the stones formerly laid under the rails by wooden sleeper, as stones for want of elasticity caused the trains to derail?" So in other words, there's no way to make a clean delineation of, who in a chain of production is actually the one who deserves this or that much of an amount. There's a kind of integration of functions again, where you can't quite tell to whom you should attribute some value.
Right. Yeah, it's very difficult to break down when you really start thinking about it. Like, we kind of get locked in this capitalist system where we think, well, who gets the lion's share? Well, the owner. The owner is the one who is responsible for all of this. The capitalist should get that. But when you start breaking it down, you realize that, maybe all the rest of us are sharing some of this cost. Like, one thing that happened a couple years ago in my area, so they have these oil platforms off the coast in California. And what happened was one of the oil lines broke. So they had to start transporting this oil by trucks down the freeway. Well, people were pretty upset because they had shown, look, your trucks doing this are wearing out the freeways sooner, and yet you're not like rebuilding the roads. You're not fixing the roads. You're just causing it to be worn out for everyone. So we're all sort of subsidizing your oil then, without you having to contribute anything, because you're the capitalist who gets to keep all the money. And yet really part of what's keeping your business going right now is us all paying for roads and keeping roads going. So when you break it down, you start to really kind of understand this point that Kropotkin is making, which is you can never really just slice up exactly who was responsible for this one product being put into a store shelf. There's really, it even goes back, like we talked about, to previous generations. Like you say, the people who built that railroad and who keeps all these things running. So once you start trying to divvy up who gets a slice, you end up in this sort of impossibility situation.
Right. And being that there's absolutely no way to divide it, you may think that means that capital, or at least the sort of risk taking, doesn't have any value. And this, I should say, this quote here actually kind of shocked me. He does seem to think that, the risk of capital does seem to merit some kind of reward. He, gives a long list of the different kinds of people who are involved in the creation of coal. And then at the very end, he says, or could it be the mine owner who has put his capital into the mine and who has, perhaps contrary to expert advice, asserted that excellent coal would be found there? Now, I'll admit I'm not quite exactly sure what to do with that quote, because on one hand, he seems to be suggesting that risk does seem to merit some kind of remuneration, that this person stood up against the experts who told them no, who told him, I would assume that it's going to be a he at this time, saying, you're not going to find any coal here, but then did find coal. But if we're doing this in a collective system, it would seem to me that, you'd only be digging coal where the experts say. And most likely, if you only listen to the experts, you're probably going to be right more than you're going to be wrong. Right. I'd imagine that, there might be some guy out there who's able to get lucky a few times, but the experts are probably more right than they are wrong.
And then doesn't he say something in there?
What to do with that quote?
Doesn't he? Trying to find where that quote is, but doesn't he say something in there too, kind of suggesting that, or what I read into it was also, if someone says drill here or dig here and they come up empty, you're not really going to punish that individual either, right? We're just all sort of working together, trying to contribute. Maybe I'm thinking of something different than you're referring. I can't find the quote. But it seems to make a little more sense. You don't get as much reward, but then you also don't have the risk. If you come up empty, you're not going to be ruined either, right? So
Well, yeah, I mean, I imagine that wealth would be distributed a little bit different in this particular society. I can't remember that quote off the top of my head, but it sounds like something he might say. So I could just be, sort of
Could be
misremembering
my
here.
interpretation.
Um, yeah, so let's kind of, I guess, sort of go through some of his criticisms first of the representative government, which is still kind of at the beginning of part one. Um, So he says, he's essentially saying here, quote, "Built up by the middle classes to hold up against royalty," referring again to the sort of parliamentary style of government, sanctioning and at the time strengthening their sway over the workers. Parliamentary rule is preeminently a middle class rule. The upholders of this system have never seriously maintained that a parliament or a municipal council represent a nation or a city. The most intelligent among them know that this is impossible. The middle class have simply used their parliamentary system to raise a protecting barrier against the pretensions of royalty without giving the people liberty. But gradually, as the people become more conscious of their real interests and the variety of their interests is growing, the system can no longer work. Therefore, Democrats of all countries vainly imagine various palliatives. The referendum is tried and found to be a failure. Proportional representation is spoken of, the representation of minorities and of other parliamentary utopias. In a word, they strive to find what is not to be found, and after each new experiment, they find or they are bound to find and to recognize that it was a failure, so that confidence in representative government vanishes more and more. I think that this is an interesting criticism of representative government that essentially entirely belongs to the middle class, and I think that it's certainly an idea which still exists in many respects today. But it also does seem like there might be ways to amend representative government and allow it to work for workers, right? Because I mean, it seems to me that you are right to point out that he's a very much so all or nothing guy. I mean, he's saying that there's representative government and that it's run by the bourgeoisie, and there's not much that you can really do about it. But there seems to be room to push back possibly here. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like he's a little light on the government part, and then spends more time kind of attacking the wage system. So he definitely kind of fleshes that out a little bit less, or in my opinion does, or I didn't see him making as profound stuff there. But yeah, I mean, he definitely kind of feels like the representative government is problematic, and the bigger it gets, the harder it's going to be to maintain this kind of stuff.
Well, he sees it as intimately tied up with the wage system, that the incentives of the parliamentary government or the representative government, what he's calling it, is to create and maintain the wage system. Because as he sees it, the wage system can only exist with the existence of poverty. We'll remember that that's been an argument that we've seen repeated and repeated and repeated throughout the book, that the only reason why the wage system is even possible is because of the fact that there are poor people to exploit. And so capitalism necessitates that there be poor people to finally exploit. And so he thinks that for that reason, the parliamentary system is not going to be sufficiently interested in eliminating or alleviating really the poverty, because of course that would just mean that their rule would end essentially.
Right.
So it's I think quite interesting. I mean, I think again though there is like legitimate reasons to possibly push back and say, hold on, maybe you're going a little bit too far. But he certainly is, I think, on to a few very important and insightful things. And I should say, this idea hasn't necessarily gone away either. I think that even among people who aren't anarchists and who aren't communist, I mean, we even see this idea on the right that like the government is just owned and controlled by a few shadowy elites out there, and that they're the ones who are really running the show, and that the people don't really have any kind of a say. So this is certainly an idea which has some kind of staying power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he takes a shot in here. I don't even remember if I highlighted, but he takes a shot in here when he's talking about wages and talks about the basically the person with the cushy job working for the government or working for the state. Maybe he says that that person usually, according to government, is going to get a much nicer wage, even though they're sitting in a nice, comfortable desk working all day, as compared to the person who's out there doing physical labor all day long. And he kind of takes a shot at him in that way. So he definitely has feelings about people who work for the government, it would seem. And
Yeah, well, actually, well, as I say, remember from our very first video, Kropotkin actually did work for the government for a little bit, and he hated his job there. So,
yeah,
I suppose that it makes a little bit of sense there. And
right.
he has a much more sort of, I suppose, direct quote to this extent. He says here, quote, "It is the same with the wage system, because once the abolition of private property is proclaimed and the possession in common of all the means of production is introduced, how can the wage system be maintained in any of its forms? This is, nevertheless, what the collectivists are doing when they recommend the use of labor checks as the mode of remuneration for labor accomplished for the great collectivist employer, the state." So again, he's really linking in the collectivist mode of production, or the collectivist approach of labor checks, I should say, and representative government, saying that you have to take these two things together in order to really be able to kind of take it down. And he's, again, as we already kind of went through this because we kind of went out of order a little bit. In part two, he kind of goes into Marx's distinction between qualified and simple work, saying that this ultimately is just going to recreate the factions which exist under capital, criticizing Marx directly. Because he thinks that ultimately, first of all, again, like I was saying earlier, you can't make these distinctions clear cut. I mean, if you're going to account for instance, the engineer or the scientist who took years and years at university to study their trade, well, why aren't you also taking into account, for instance, the worker who has been working in the mines since age 11?
Right.
And right, because that's the justification, at least according to Kropotkin, that the socialists use on the basis of their labor theory of value, essentially saying that, well, it must be the case then that their production, or at least to produce the engineer, to produce the scientist, it took a lot longer in terms of training. But Kropotkin is essentially saying, well, hold on. I mean, the miner also took a really long time in order to produce that level of expertise. Why are you just assuming that, certain kinds of bourgeois labor, that's the kind of production to, so for instance, like education or to college? Like, why are we just assuming that that's the thing that is valuable as opposed to basket weaving? Or I'm not sure if it's basket weaving, but he talks about weavers, for instance, and things like that.
Right.
So I think it's interesting.
Yeah, and that comparison between, essentially people wanting to make a different wage, being in a different class, and I was even a little offended when he talked about engineers, scientists, and doctors merely exploit their capital, their diplomas, as middle-class employers exploit a factory, or as nobles use to exploit their titles or nobility. So, but he has a point there that once you have that diploma, that is sort of like a capital. You now get to demand more in the workplace. And I think I thought about that a little bit. And I think part of it is like, okay, say you have a surgeon, right? They go out, they are justifying that one of the reasons they're going to make so much is because, first of all, they were probably didn't have a lot of money while they were in school. Like I remember being in grad school, it's like you're basically like barely getting by. And then you get this degree, and then you're like, oh, well, I'm also $300,000 in debt from going to medical school, right? So then they can demand more. But under this system, a doctor wouldn't have to go $300,000 in debt to become some kind of special surgeon, right? Would be the idea. You would be more comfortable during that period of time while you were studying. That would be almost like part of your job, I guess, or you would be contributing in some way. He doesn't outright say that, but I imagine you're not going to be going seriously into debt when you're studying to become something. So then you wouldn't have to demand that, well, the surgeon should get paid 3 times as much because he has to pay off all his school debt. You wouldn't have that school debt. So then there's a lot more argument that, yeah, the surgeon should make as much as the coal miner because, there isn't this past hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt that they're trying to pay off. So I think it kind of, at least for our modern system, and I know it wasn't this way when he wrote this book, but now it's like to get those positions, you have to make some pretty large sacrifices. But under this system, you wouldn't have to make those sacrifices unless you're already rich to begin with, in order to get to that point where you're ready to make more. So you wouldn't have as much justification that a doctor or engineer needs to make more, right?
Right. And to this end, I think that this gets to where his, I think, most deadly criticism, or at least what Kropotkin would see as his most deadly criticism, I think that whether or not it is the most deadly criticism is another question. But what Kropotkin sees as the most deadly criticism of the labor theory of value is essentially just a criticism of all approaches of wage theories for that specific reason there, that it's just trying to justify the system as it presently exists. So I'm going to read this quote here. He says, quote, "For us, the scale of remuneration is a complex result of taxes, of governmental tutelage, and of capitalist monopoly. In other words, of the state and capital. Therefore, we say that all wage theories have been invented after the fact, or after the event, to justify injustices which presently exist, and that we need not take them into consideration." And so he's basically rejecting the labor theory of value and rejecting the idea of a distinction between complex and simple labor, because he just sees it as a sort of continuation of the prejudices which exist in present capitalist society, where we're valuing certain sorts of investment into labor, such as engineers, such as doctors, such as scientists or mathematicians or philosophers, as opposed to the investments which miners or weavers have to take in order to undergo their craft. And so he's essentially saying that this is a sort of bias, and that this entire wage system, the justification of wage system, even the communist system, which he has said earlier and previously in the book, is better than the bourgeois capitalist system. But he's saying that even this system doesn't go far enough, that even this system finally is just a justification of the current system. And so we have to step outside of even that if we're envisioning the next society, or else we're just going to recreate capitalism. Right.
Yeah, and it kind of ties together with what we were talking about earlier, where he kind of, like, it makes sense. Okay, so coal, the person digging the coal, really important. The person drilling for oil, really important, like the actual workers, because, you know, we might value those jobs less by saying in a capitalist system they're more replaceable because they maybe are not, you know, quote unquote, as skilled. And yet, if that coal wasn't there, if that oil wasn't there, then how many products couldn't be produced because that energy isn't available to do whatever it is that people need with it. So it's very much necessary. It's not like it's not important. We're just valuing the people doing that job as less important. And I think it's interesting to point that out and say, no, that's not how we need to do this, because that work is absolutely necessary for all this other work to go into play. And then he even breaks it down with the coal, where he's saying, well, what part of the coal miner is most important? Is it the person that's manning the elevator? Is it the person who's watching to make sure that no one's about to get, you know, in a dangerous situation when they're in the coal mine? Is it the person doing the digging? Is it the engineer who's telling everyone where to dig? And you just kind of go down this rabbit hole of realizing, yeah, I guess it's all pretty necessary. It's all pretty important.
I would be curious to hear Kropotkin's response to more contemporary formulations which attempt to justify the current wage system. For instance, you'll oftentimes hear from economists today this idea of the sort of rare skills argument. And so, you know, for instance, in the case of a scientist, you know, they would argue that it's more likely that a scientist could take upon an occupation of a coal miner. Maybe they wouldn't want to, but it's more likely that they would be able to do that than if you were to take a random coal miner and they would have been able to become a scientist. Or whether, you know, it isn't all sort of intellectual labor, but it's, you know, the various kinds of skills which you might have, that rare skills which also happen to be valued by the market are those skills which are remunerated the most, right? In a kind of supply and demand argument. That seems to be an idea which Kropotkin, or I should say, perhaps that idea hadn't been fully fleshed out by economists contemporary to Kropotkin, and so he doesn't seem to have any kind of response to that. I mean, he does have glimpses of it. I mean, we were talking earlier about how he's talking about how all of the wealth, the value of a particular product is from monopoly, but it's quite different, I think, than how contemporary economists would formulate the problem. And so I'd be curious how he would respond to people who would make the case to justify the wage system today.
Yeah, my guess is he would say it was sort of essentially the same, because if we have these rare skills or whatever, my guess is he was saying there would be more people available to go into that area, right? But I don't know what his reaction would be. But
my response to that sort of argument is always to say, well, it's not the case that any individual always deserves that kind of remuneration. I mean, there's no reason, for instance, I mean, sure, yeah, you have certain skills which are certainly valuable. For instance, like the skills which are required to become a great basketball player, right? But there's no reason why any particular society should value those particular skills. It requires the art, the form, the sport of basketball to exist for the skills which value basketball to have any kind of value. And so there's still a sense in which Kropotkin can turn around and do the sort of argument that he typically does, which is that all of society exists together and that you can't ever disentangle the values which belong to an individual or a value of society. My guess is that that's how Kropotkin would try to tangle it, a kind of just sort of critique that, like, at the end of the day, yeah, you might have skills, but there's no reason why you're justified in being born into this or that particular society. That's my guess how he would try to tackle it, but obviously we can't raise the dead and speak to Kropotkin and ask him.
Yeah, I think he just sort of wouldn't sort of recognize the value. Like, I mean, I don't even know that I buy it, this idea that there's only certain individuals who can do certain jobs. I mean, it seems like so much of what you become in this country has to do with, day one, where were you born? What family were you born into? Right. All that kind of stuff, which we wouldn't have under this kind of a system.
That's exactly the point there. Like, why is it the case that you were justified in being born into this particular society or this particular part of this society, right? There's a kind of question there. Like, you could have all the perfect skills to be a wonderful basketball player, but then be born 1,000 years too early and end up being, incredibly poor, and so there's a certain sense in which all of our value is in a certain ways related to the society and the values which a particular society holds. So, I mean, for instance, what is a mathematician going to do, before the invention of mathematics? I mean, Chris, what would you have been doing, if you were born 3,000 years? Well, I suppose there was some kinds of math, maybe 5,000 years ago, like what would you have been doing,
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, maybe out counting sheep or something. I don't know. Or even before that, I guess, before even basic math. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's a good question, right? If you're born out of time, if you're born out of place, what are you going to do? I mean, it could be that, 50 years from now, maybe no one cares about basketball. And if LeBron James is born in that era, he's, a grocery clerk or something, you just,
right.
Who knows?
Right. And so I think there are some more interesting points towards the end when he's getting into his ideas of charity, because at the end of the day, he seems to be thinking that all of these systems at the end of the day still rely on some kind of Christian charity. And he goes in to talk about how all of society ultimately relies on individuals giving more than they receive. He talks about mothers, for instance, who constantly give up their day and constantly care. I'm trying to find the exact quote. But yeah, he basically, I mean, it's pretty straightforward. He basically says that, mothers have to constantly give up more than they take in order to raise a child, and that this has to do and is related to all of our aspects of social life. And he seems to think at the end of the day, we were talking about how the wage system creates factions. He seems to think at the end of the day that the real problem here is that whether it's the wage system or the representative system of government, at the end of the day, it's turning our social relationships and perverting them. It's turning our social relationships into individualist, calculating relationships of debit and credit. Let me read a quote to that effect. He says, "If middle-class society is decaying, if we have gotten into a blind alley from which we cannot emerge without attacking past institutions with torch and hatchet, it is precisely because we have given too much to counting. It is because we have let ourselves be influenced into giving only and to receive, and into receiving. It is into giving only in order to receive. It is because we have aimed at turning society into a commercial company based on debit and credit. And so all of our social relationships are becoming a relationship of, okay, how much did you give me? Let me make sure I give just that much back and no amount more than that." He has another quote to this effect, specifically referring to how this affects social and more personal relationships. He says here, quote, "And in a wider sphere of things, in the truest sphere of life, with all of its joys and sufferings and all of its accidents, cannot each one of us recall someone who has rendered to him or her, or I should say he only says him, but today we would add her, such a great so much a great of a service that we should be indignant if its equivalent in coin were to be mentioned. The service may have been but a word, nothing but a spoken word at the right time, or else it may have been months and years of devotion. And are we going to appraise these incalculable services in labor notes? And he says, no, that's absolutely absurd. In fact, it's actually offensive in social and personal relationships. It's offensive in personal relationships to turn around and say, can I pay you for being nice to me this day? Can we find some kind of way of calculating this value? Can we find some kind of utilitarian principle upon which to value this or that particular sort of social and close relationship with one another? That this doesn't make any sense, and that if we try to do that, it just explodes everything. And again, that all of society, the rearing of children, whether it's the mother or the father, that all of these things are all on the basis of giving more than we receive, and that this highest form of life in child giving, in caring for one another, in caring for the sick and the elderly, that in giving more than we receive, this is where we find our fulfillment, and that this is where we find our value in a certain way. He doesn't quite say well-being, but that we do seem to find our value in caring for one another and for in a certain way. And he talks about how they say society will not fail to maintain and bring up its children to help both the aged and the infirm. Without a doubt, the needs will be the measure of the cost of society, which will that it will burden itself with to temper the principle of deeds. So this is, I think, interesting. What do you think, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, it falls into a category that is just something that sort of interests me in general, which is the idea of measurement. Because measurement, a lot of times we think is very, very simple. And yet when you try to measure something from the uncertainty principle in quantum mechanics all the way up to like large scale statistical polling, anytime you try to measure anything, it's actually a mess. It's really hard to know if what you think you measured is what you actually measured. And a lot of times, the more, like literally the uncertainty principle, the more you try to measure something, the less you know about the other stuff, right? So it's, in some ways, that's what we're doing here with this capitalist system, is we're measuring, to kind of back to a point you made earlier, we're measuring how much did you earn? How much did you give me? It's all measured with this in some monetary way, and it's difficult, right? So the part where he talked about women, I found interesting because the reason that women make less in today's society, it's complicated, right? There's many issues, but one of them seems to be that women have to exit the workforce. At least some women exit the workforce in order to raise children or have babies or raise children, and then sometimes, so in that time, they're not getting promotions and that kind of stuff because they're sort of out of the system. And yet, as a society, we don't value that part. And of course, having children is a value to society, because if women stopped having children, there wouldn't be a society, right? It would just sort of all go away. So in some sense, we need that. We need people reproducing, and yet in a capitalist system, it almost hurts you if you're going to do that, or it can hurt you in some instances. And there's no real way to measure that. There's no real way to measure like what all these different contributions are to real, we try to with dollars. That's how we measure so many things, is with dollars. And yet it clearly fails, right? This system of us all giving dollars to one another and taking dollars from each other, sort of that measurement comes up short in numerous ways, right?
Right, and Kropotkin seems to think that this attempt at measuring is bad from the get-go, that
right.
Just trying to measure can be an offense, as we were mentioning there earlier, that, there are certain things in life that even just trying to measure, or even say, can I pay you for this, is just offensive, that, for certain sorts of relationships, this shouldn't be how it is. He has an interesting quote at the very end of the chapter. He says here, quote, "And when we shall have tasted this joy, we will have set to work the demolition of the last vestiges of middle-class rule, its morality drawn from account books, its debit and credit philosophy, its mine and yours institutions. In its demolishing, we shall build." And so I think here he's saying that in order to really root out the system, in order to really root out the wage system, in order to really root out capitalism, we have to completely go to the bottom of this mine and yours mentality, that we have to make all of our relationships, finally, all of our relationships much more, in a certain way, intimate, making it and modeling all of our relationships in a certain way, not perfectly, but in a certain way, off of the model of the close friend, off of a model of the friend who, when they render something to you, you would be offended if, or they would be offended if you tried to turn around and respond with coins, right? Because he's talking about how throughout this book, or excuse me, throughout this chapter, he's talking about how the various kinds of labors, the various kinds of we might say what are they like companies or job places, whether he's talking about the trains or the development of the transatlantic cable or the other examples he uses. All of these things, it's never quite clear where exactly that distinction lies, like who created the wealth here or there. And so I think that he's saying that all of these different, industries, whether it's again the train factories or the like, should be thought of in that way, that we're just sharing in a common project together. We're not trying to divide it up and decide who gets what, because that's where the distinctions start. That's where we start degrading our social lives with one another. And I think that he has a real problem with that. I was mentioning to you at the beginning of this stream an example that I remembered back from when I was in high school. One of my close friends, Scott, we used to always hang out and we'd get Little Caesars pizza because it was the cheapest pizza, the only one we could, really afford. And one of the things he would do sometimes, particularly when he was hungry, is he would divide the pizza directly in half because we usually split the cost, though not always. Oftentimes we just sort of take turns on who paid, and we didn't always sort of keep track of it. But what he would end up doing sometimes is split it just directly in half and say, okay, this is your half, that's my half. And I remember the first couple times this happened, I felt a kind of offense to it. I felt sort of like, well, hold on, we're sharing together. We're sharing a meal together. Why are you cutting it in half? Why are you dividing it? And it took me a long time to realize that what was really going on is I had a gut visceral reaction to this idea that our friendship should be proportional in that way. Like we're here. We're trying to share a meal together. We're sharing this common project, and we're sharing a conversation together. And I think that Kropotkin would think that we should be modeling our social life after this as well, modeling the production that we have on the basis of industry, on the basis of railroad trains, And so there is no way to distinguish whether or not the engineer who invented this or that part of the locomotive should be getting this or that portion of the pizza, or this or that portion. The person who decided to switch from using stones underneath the rail tracks to using wood because it would be more efficient because of the elasticity of the wood, right? That there's no way to really apportion that thing. And so Kropotkin seems to be modeling our social life on that kind of intimate kind of friendship. And I think, Chris, I was mentioning to you at the beginning of this that there might be a question to be had here. Like, is it the case that in a good society, all of our friendships are truly modeled off of that intimate kind of friendship? That, maybe not all the friendships are as close to the center of, this sort of, we'll imagine this particular circle be like the perfect friend, and that it's just sort of radiating off, that it's just a question of how close we are to the perfect friend. That maybe there are just different kinds of friends. And that, you have a friend, for instance, with the local grocery store clerk who always checks you out, and you chat with them, and you have they remember the name of your kids. They remember the name of the people in your family. And they're like, oh, how is this class going? How is that going for you? And that, sure, if they moved and went to another place, you'd never really try to contact them again. But in a certain way, they're still a friend. And in the same way with, maybe friends that you chat with at the gym or chat with throughout the day, or maybe your work friends that, yeah, you're friends with them. You wouldn't call them friends. Maybe you have them over once or twice a week, but you're still friends with them. But maybe if they moved away, you wouldn't necessarily even try or even really want to maintain that friendship, but there's still a certain kind of value in it. And I wonder if trying to angle all of our friendships towards that ideal of the perfect friend might degrade in some way, some aspect of life, which, we don't always want to be perfectly intimate with absolutely everyone. That it's sometimes good or healthy for us to have relationships in which we're not trying to be always completely intimate, but but obviously we all need those relationships which are perfectly intimate with certain people. And so I wonder if there's reason to push back on Kropotkin there, just for how he's envisioning the perfect social relationship. Maybe the perfect social relationship does involve different kinds of friends and not merely a question of how close a particular person is to the ideal of friendship. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I
Am I just
mean,
crazy?
there's different approaches to that, and I definitely kind of get the story about the pizza because I've had periods of my life where I didn't have as much as I felt like I needed. And in that case, it's scary because when you already don't have enough, the last thing you want is to not get the share that you think you deserve. And then also you don't want to eat your friend's share. So I get the splitting of the pizza in half to making sure, well, I get mine. I don't want to accidentally eat some of Peyton's pizza and then I've taken too much, but I don't want someone to eat my pizza either. But, yeah, and maybe this is kind of a privileged position, but as I've gotten older, I find that I'm sort of a happier individual when you don't have to worry about that kind of stuff. It's like there's a pizza, and if I'm still hungry when it's done, I'll do something else, right? I'll get some other thing that will fill me up or whatever I need to do, and then you can just kind of focus on the friends and that kind of stuff. So it is interesting. It's an interesting point you make about this approach to friendship, and probably some of it is cultural. What family you grew up in, they probably have a different way of divvying things up. But it is, I think, it's interesting to take the points in the book and sort of apply it to this keeping track of friendships the way that you're talking about, because it's something that I think people do intuitively. They don't even necessarily think about it. They're not like deciding, okay, is there lots of different ways of divvying up this pizza? They just kind of naturally do it in the way they think makes the most sense. But it is kind of, there's an underlying philosophy there, I guess, without even really acknowledging that philosophy that is interesting to investigate.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it like for me at least, it would have been, and it always was better when we didn't divvy up the pizza in a certain way, that we were just chatting, and when I wanted a pizza slice, he would, I'd grab my slice and
Right.
he'd grab his slice, and we'd just end up sort of chatting, and that was the more enjoyable times. And I think that there is, like, I think for that reason, a very deep relationship between friendship and politics.
Mm-hmm.
That I don't know that we can ever truly disentangle these two things. Some people go so far as to say that politics is about trying to determine friendship in the highest possible form. And I think that whenever we think about politics, we are in a certain way envisioning the ideal of friendship. Envisioning the ideal of intimate relationships or less intimate relationships, and how that would play out on the biggest possible scene. I think that Kropotkin saw a glimpse of this. I think that Kropotkin, he more or less says it in the one quote we were talking about earlier with close friends, and how they would be offended by proportional allocations of goods. And so I do think that these things are all very important for thinking about relating with one another. When we engage in social life and personal life as well. I've always been, I should say, someone who, when I read political philosophy, I'm also thinking about how I can apply it to my friendships with one another. I think that it's always very important to read politics, read the world, and think about, okay, how can I apply this to my life today? And I think that Kropotkin does have an interesting approach to friendship. I'm not sure that it's my approach to friendship, but certainly his politics is quite very interesting. Public Citizen in the chat, or at least in my chat here, saying that all slices must be equal. Just kidding. But he's saying here that his politics are deeply based upon his personal interactions in his life. I think that that's unavoidable in many respects. I don't know what you think, Chris.
Yeah, I think it definitely is a continuation of those things. And for many people, I think it is more disconnected, where it's like, some people in their personal life try to be a little bit more ethical, but then see it as okay to have a very cutthroat, maybe even mean type political system. But if you can kind of connect those, I think it maybe gives you a little bit more empathy. It invests you a little bit more in that system to really think about what the whole political system is doing for everyone involved. And I think it can help both ways, right? It can help you with your how you do relationships on a personal level, and then how you look at politics.
Aristotle famously said that friendship was preferable to justice, because justice requires friendship, but friendship, it does not require justice. I would push it perhaps even a step further and say that justice can undermine friendship. That if we try to equally divide the pizza, it can actually undermine friendship quite a little bit. So I would go a step beyond Aristotle in that respect.
Yeah.
But I think that, from the very beginning of political philosophy, whether it was Plato envisioning, the sharing of wives or things like this, which today we would call quite sexist. But by that, he also meant the sharing of friends and the like. To Aristotle's approach, from the very beginning, political philosophy has always been very deeply grounded in this idea of friendship and how it relates to one another. Our contemporary system appears to treat politics as economics by other means. That at the end of the day, politics is just about maximizing the GDP. It's just about maximizing economic growth in a certain sphere of life. Maybe we're trying to control economics around the edges, but at the end of the day, we're still concerned about the economy and how people relate to one another in a transactional way. Kropotkin is leveling, I think, a very deep and incisive criticism of this approach to politics, which deeply grounds neoliberal thought and I think gives us very strong warrant for reconsidering that in the political sphere and also in our personal sphere when we relate to one another in personal matters.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So for next week, do you want to take a look at chapter 14 or do you want to try to look at 14 and 15? What do you think?
Let's see. How long is it? Looks like
14 is kind of short. So let's see. Yeah, 15 is also really short. So we can. Yeah. So let's do 14 and 15 for next week. Next week, we'll be looking at the Conquest of Bread, chapters 14 and 15. We just finished up chapter 13. So thank you, everybody, so much for joining. We'll be back again in a few minutes to chat about the news, politics, all the crazy stuff going on in the world right now. I mean, my God, politics right now is so heated up, so crazy. Yeah. So much stuff happening so fast. So it seems like we're going to have a lot to talk about. So we'll see you all then. But for now, thank you so much for joining.
Yep. Thanks, everybody. We'll catch you later.